This presentation is part of the academic webinar series of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. To view a full catalog of our past presentations and for a schedule of our upcoming webinars, please visit nonviolent-conflict.org and click on the Learning and Resources tab. Good afternoon and welcome to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict academic webinar series. My name is Jake Fitzpatrick and I'm the Content Development Associate at ICNC, and today's webinar is titled Sustaining a Movement, the Resilience of Brazilian Women in a Nonviolent Struggle for Rights, and will be presented by Rubin and Emma Sokoloff-Rubin. And today's presentation will be between 30 to 40 minutes in length and will be followed by 20 to 30 minutes of question and answers. Emma Sokoloff-Rubin is a reporter for Gotham Schools in New York. She graduated from Yale in 2011 with honors in history. A recipient of a Yale Howland Fellowship in Research and Public Service, Emma spent the past year in Buenos Aires researching how local high schools approach teaching about Argentina's history of dictatorship. She has written on Latin America for The Nation, The Atlantic Online, Ms. Magazine, Guernica Daily, Reuters, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Yale Historical Review. Rubin is Associate Professor of History and Research Associate at the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Boston University. He is the author of Decentering the Regime, Ethnicity, Radicalism, and Democracy in Juchitán, Mexico, the co-author with Emma Sokoloff-Rubin of Sustaining Activism, a Brazilian women's movement and a father-daughter collaboration, and co-editor with Viviane Bennett of Enduring Reform, Business Responses to Progressive Activism in Latin America's Democracies. Dr. Rubin has written widely on Mexican and Brazilian politics and Latin American social movements. He received a MacArthur Foundation Research and Writing Grant and a Fulbright Fellowship for his work on democracy and grassroots innovation in Brazil, and a sabbatical fellowship from the American Philosophical Society for his work on sustaining activism and enduring reform. Dr. Rubin has held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Center for Critical Analysis of Contemporary Culture at Rutgers, and the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And with that, I will hand it over to our presenters.
Hi everyone. We want to thank ICNC for inviting us to do this webinar and giving us an opportunity to share our work. We're very happy to be here. I'm Rubin, and I'll be starting off the presentation.
And I'm Emma Sokoloff-Rubin, and I'll be picking up in a little while.
And we'll be going back and forth between us and both responding to your questions. Now, to start us off, the overarching theme of our story is the arc of political change that has occurred in Brazil since the early 1980s. How did Brazil come to be the influential, democratic, and economically successful nation that it is today? Two forms of nonviolent activism have played key roles in this surprising and hope-inspiring outcome. In 1964, Brazil experienced one of Latin America's first brutal and long-lasting military coups of the second half of the 20th century. The military then ruled Brazil until 1985, 21 years, through oppression, torture, the silencing of anyone who tried to speak out, and the manipulation or closing down of institutions of political representation. Today, in contrast, Brazil's president is a leftist woman, once a member of a guerrilla opposition. Dilma Rousseff, like her predecessor, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula, presides over an increasingly democratic society in terms of the procedures of democratic government, as well as a growing economy with relatively inclusive, if limited, social welfare programs. Brazil is perhaps the preeminent example in the world today of a transition from democracy to dictatorship that has been accompanied by economic growth and lessening inequality over the course of 25 years. Now, it's important to note here that Brazil continues to be a highly unequal country with very uneven rule of law and high levels of violence. However, since the mid-1980s, there's been a marked trajectory from dictatorship and torture to democracy, civil society activism, and successful and somewhat more inclusive economic growth. Brazil's success and prominence have gotten a lot of international political and media attention. But one of the main reasons for these successes has not. The transition from military rule to the establishment of democracy in Brazil, and the laws and implementation of those laws that have made those new democratic rights significant. These changes were possible because of the willingness and ability of Brazilians across the vast country to get out into the streets and protest, to form nonviolent social movements and other forms of extra-institutional organizing with great innovation and creativity, and to bring that innovation at times into government institutions. And now, for just a bit of Latin America context, now that I've said that about Brazil. In Brazil, as in most of the rest of Latin America, the intransigence of right-wing governments, militaries, and private sectors precluded significant socioeconomic reform for most of the 20th century. The ubiquity of repression in the 20th century in the face of reformist initiatives led to reliance on violent forms of struggle in many countries, such as Mexico during its revolution in the teens, Cuba in the 1950s, parts of Venezuela and Colombia in the 1960s, and Nicaragua and the rest of Central America in the 1970s and 1980s. So there's a real history of violent activism. At the same time, nonviolent activism produced impressive results. In Guatemala in the 1950s under Jacobo Arbenz, and in Chile in the 1960s, culminating in the election of Salvador Allende in 1970. However, violent and nonviolent struggles alike, indeed, wherever in Latin America people fought for progressive social change, resulted in military takeovers that began in 1954 and continued through the 1970s with U.S. support. The militaries that took power in these coups governed most of Latin America through the mid-1980s. In contrast, successful campaigns to oust Latin American militaries were largely nonviolent, waged by a panoply of social movements that included workers, unions, women, middle-class journalists and teachers, and indigenous people. Those social movements not only contributed to ousting militaries, which was the first achievement, but they played direct roles in shaping the writing of constitutions and the implementation of constitutional rights, which itself was often a long, uncertain, and dangerous process. Social movements continue today to play a central role in extending and deepening citizenship in matters not covered explicitly by constitutions, thereby extending social justice in societies where rights and well-being are uneven and often precarious. It is worth stating that social movements in Latin America in recent decades have been almost exclusively nonviolent. Change in Latin America's democracies, as elsewhere, often happens at what we might call the borders of violence, but overwhelmingly on the nonviolent side of that shifting and consequential line. Latin America has been one of the regions of the world where techniques of nonviolent activism have been pioneered. For Latin America's social movements since the 1980s, the most compelling question has not been violent or nonviolent, but rather in the streets or in the institutions. For those impassioned by a vision of social justice, where is the fight for a better future best undertaken? Our story today is about what this kind of nonviolent organizing means and how it happens. How do movements form to codify and implement new constitutional rights? And what happens to mobilized movements after the first big successes are achieved? Why are nonviolent social movements essential for democracies? We add a further dimension to these questions by focusing on women's activism in struggles for economic equality for women and for equal roles for women in families and communities. We focus on women whose nonviolent activism to overthrow dictatorship and establish economic justice was intertwined from the get-go with a vision of women's rights and equality. By getting inside the experience of women's movement activists, conveying some of its texture and meanings, we begin to understand both how a movement endures and how it fragments, along with what the consequences are of that endurance and fragmentation for the women involved and for possibilities of deepening democracy. By examining these women's lives and the places where nonviolent activism changed politics, we try to illustrate what each woman holds in order to be an activist and to get at the experiences of pain and shame, as well as hope and enchantment that accompany their commitment. This research involved multiple visits to 2 towns in the southern Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, starting in 1997 and ending in 2012. Emma first met the women and visited Ibiraiaras and Sananduva in 2001-2002, when I spent a year in Brazil doing research on 4 social movements, and my family accompanied me. Our joint research began in 2004, and we returned in 2007, 2008, and 2012. Our analysis is based on many weeks of participant observation and more than 50 in-depth interviews, between 1 and 3 hours each in length, most of them videotaped, with women's movement leaders and participants, women who do not participate in the movement, family members of women's movement activists, priests, nuns, politicians, union leaders, academics, and staff members of local NGOs. And with that introduction, I'll turn the story over to Emma.
I'm going to speak now about the origins of the women's movement, how it formed and what form the movement took in its first years. And then together, Jeff and I will speak more about what's happening with the movement now and bring you inside the lives of several of the activists who gave the movement its force over time. The movement formed, this Brazilian women's movement formed in 1985, when women in their teens, together with women of their mother's generation, formed local groups in small towns in the interior of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil's southernmost state. They called these groups Mulheres da Roça, or farm women. The women who started these movements, they were in their teens, early 20s. They were older than I was when I first met them years later. 4 years later, so in 1989, the small groups joined together into a statewide movement, which they called the Movement of Rural Women Workers. In 2003, that movement took a lead role in forming a national women's movement. The Movement of Rural Women Workers, which I'll call the MMTR, as it's termed in Portuguese, formed at a time when youth were being politicized by priests and nuns, influenced by liberation theology. Many of those priests and nuns were from this region as well. And it was the nuns who pressed women and girls to see themselves as bearers of rights and to think about a world where they would have both greater economic parity with men and more voice within their families and communities. The nuns literally went door to door, first alone and then accompanied by teenage activists, meeting with women individually. And this activism of nuns and young women occurred in tandem with other grassroots movements, one seeking to make government-sponsored unions more democratic, and another the movement of landless people, or the MST, a land takeover movement. In fact, this region of Brazil, the interior of Rio Grande do Sul, was a hotbed of radical organizing during the years of transition from dictatorship to democracy. And the women's movement itself became active regionally and nationally during the period just following the dictatorship, when a new post-military constitution was being written. The movement joined other women's groups to press for the inclusion in the Constitution of rights for women as workers. This indeed occurred in the 1988 Constitution. But rights on paper didn't immediately mean rights in reality, and there followed a 10-year process of pressing for the implementation of newly won rights to Social Security, maternity leave, and health care. And even after these rights were won, women in the movement realized that for many, many women throughout the southern Brazilian countryside, having a right didn't mean they could actually secure it, because a lot of women didn't have birth certificates. They didn't have documents that proved that they existed, that they could then use to gain access to rights. And so one of the women's movement's main campaigns was a documentation campaign where they drove buses across the countryside and brought women to towns where they could sign for birth certificates. And in milestone achievements, including extensive protests and demonstrations in the state and in Brasilia, the national capital, the women's movement secured these rights and gave women access to these rights by the mid-1990s. These protests were innovative and unexpected. Some took the form of occupying a street in front of the governor's building, others occupying a main highway, and others involved sometimes entering a government building in pairs and hiding out in the bathroom until they could all stream out and demand a meeting with the governor or other government official. And as these historic battles were won, women's movement activists had to decide on their goals moving forward with regard to economic rights and to gender issues. So in a way, the movement reached what we could call a new stage, a moment when the concrete initial goals to form a movement, to secure rights, maternity leave and pensions, to secure documents for women so they could access these rights, those initial goals had been achieved. And there was still so much need for change. Many women still felt that they need to ask permission to leave the house. They needed to ask their husband's permission to leave the house. There were still many legal rights women didn't have and rights they didn't have in their own homes. So there was still so much need for change, but less clarity about where to start.
So what happens after the regime is toppled, or in our case, after new constitutional rights to pensions and maternity leave are implemented? In the first long struggle, it's often possible for many different people and groups to unify around a core set of demands, to oust the dictators, to establish rights to participation, to implement basic new rights. What movements experience next is often new uncertainty and disagreement about goals. In the case of the rural women's movement, what is the most important next step in the view of the many different movement leaders and participants? Is it a fair distribution of land, which involves expropriation and redistribution, as well as close cooperation with the MST, Brazil's movement of landless people? Should the next goal be a new regional economy based on community projects and local solidarity? What about issues pertaining specifically to women? Should women's health be the main goal, focused on pressing the government to implement its promised universal healthcare system? Or gender discrimination and violence against women? In this context, after the dictatorship has fallen and once a new constitution and the most basic democratic procedures and constitutional rights are in place, in this new context, what should a nonviolent movement be? How will its goals and strategies relate to elections and new local and national political institutions? And what about internal democracy within the movement? How will social movements make decisions about how to proceed? Will it be possible to contain so much plurality and difference within one movement? And should containing that difference and plurality be the goal?
We hear a lot about the hardships of violent conflict, and we want to talk for a moment about the hardships of non-violent activism by bringing you into the lives of several women who formed the core of the Brazilian women's movement. We want to give you a window into the real difficulties that come with assembling and sustaining a movement over time, and the way that being an activist, in a sense, can be threatening to the sense of self, to personal relationships, to speech, even as it makes all of those things possible at the same time. And the way in which activism creates meaning, and for many people, the opportunity to envision a future and to in some ways bring that future right into the present, even if their daily lives do not always line up with the world that they envision and fight for. We want to bring you inside this movement because the texture of individual people's lives was what was most engaging for our research and what helped us better understand what sustains nonviolent movements over time, and the tensions, decisions, choices, shame, pain, embarrassment, silencing, and what it means to put yourself out there in a movement and in your own community. I'll start by talking about Monica. Monica is a participant in the women's movement and has been for many years. She shows us that making change is not just about fighting for power or fighting for rights, but also about changing people. Monica makes everything her family eats, except sugar, salt, and coffee. The farm where she lives with her husband, Joacir Marchesini, and their 4 children is 5 kilometers from the center of Ibiraiaras, the nearest town, and they don't own a car. Monica relies on erratic buses and rides from neighbors to get into town, where she buys the 3 items she doesn't produce, attends church, and when her husband lets her, goes to women's movement meetings. In a way, Monica's life looks much like her mother's. She does farm work from dawn to dusk. She milks the cows first thing in the morning. She tends to the cows again in the evening. And in between, she's doing laundry, she's making meals, she's cleaning, she's working in the garden, she's working in the fields. She's responsible for an immense amount of work on her farm. But the way she talks about her work is different than the way her mother talked about her work. And the gap between what she fights for as part of the women's movement and the way her daily life looks drives her activism and leads to change that is real if slow. In other words, while Monica's daily tasks are not so different from women who came before her, the way she frames those tasks is, as are the dynamics within her family. What do I mean by the gap between what Monica envisions and the life she lives? It means there are changes that she hopes for and talks about that haven't yet happened. She still does all the housework. Her sons still don't help. And often she'll say things like, I can't wait for my daughter to grow up, to be able to help at home. And I remember thinking once, after spending an afternoon in Monica's home, her statements don't line up. She's contradicting herself. She just said that both men and women eat meals and track dirt into the house, so they should clean up together. But then she said her husband is tired, so he needs to watch TV. She said she can't wait for her daughter to get older, so there's someone to help, even though she has 3 sons and believes that boys should help too. But watching Monica wash dishes and talk about her family, it struck me that the contradictory things she was saying were also deeply true. Monica lives in this space of contradiction. She hopes for one thing and lives another. This is perhaps what the women's movement in Ibirayaras asks women most persistently to do, to believe in a vision of a different world, in a world where men and women do equal amounts of housework, have equal rights, have equal pay, while living deeply immersed in the reality of this one. And Dad and I have come to use the phrase holding paradox to describe what Monica is doing when she talks about a vision of the world not yet reflected in her daily life. She holds paradox by fighting for change, even as many parts of her life stay the same. Monica is faced each day with what she is fighting against and what she is fighting for. Because like like really all women I met in the women's movement in Brazil, she's not fighting to leave. A lot of the women I talked to said they're fighting to change their communities, to change gender dynamics, to secure more rights for women, so that they can bear to stay. The leaders of the women's movement wanted to be able to raise children in the same towns where they grew up. Monica wants to be able to continue working on her farm. And so in some ways, she's fighting for the very place she's trying to change. And it's no surprise then that she is steadfastly committed to fighting for change, and much of the work of the movement falls to women like her. And lastly, I'll just say that Monica spoke differently about her work from the way I would have expected women in generations before her to speak. When we asked what she thinks about while she milks the cows on her farm, she answers that she thinks about the contribution it makes to the family economy, that it provides milk for children to drink and cream and cheese to sell. She didn't say, this is women's work, it's what I have to do. She said, this is a contribution I make to my family.
Izaneti Kola is an organizer for the women's movement. She goes door to door explaining to women what the movement is and why they should join. Izaneti's own trajectory to activism involved leaving the countryside because it seemed like a dead end, then returning with her husband Fernando and a new vision for sustainable agriculture. Over time, with faltering steps, Izaneti found her way first to the Workers' Party and then to the rural women's movement. Women in the women's movement often say that as soon as other women have their eyes opened and see the oppression around them and to which they are subject, they'll join the women's movement. But Izaneti knows from hard experience that that's not the case. She knocks on doors and visits and returns, but she has learned over years that women's lives are rooted in local cultures and tasks, and many women view her with suspicion or will take a few steps and go no further. For one thing, women believe in a male God who counsels obedience. They distrust Izanetti for all her questioning, perhaps fearful of losing a mooring that they value and need. Women encounter numerous self-help strategies that tell them that their problems stem from their own psychologies, that to change the world, they need to change their mindset and wake up with a smile. And women who take heed of Izanetti's warnings about pesticides and genetically altered crops, women who worry about their children's health, may face husbands far less willing to change. Often, that's a dead end for the women themselves and for Izanetti. It is too painful to face resistance at home. As I talked to Izanetti, she showed me piece by piece what she was up against in organizing a movement. The Catholic Church, pleasure in cooking, husbands who won't question genetically modified crops, the psychologist on the radio telling women that everything is flowers. At first, I wondered if Izanetti couldn't make the imaginative leap to understand what attracts people to these other worldviews. Yet what was most striking about our discussions, when I thought about them a bit longer, was how genuinely aware and puzzled Izanetti is by the local world in which she lives and which she seeks to change. How much there is that works against her and other activists and confuses and complicates what they see to be true. We know the world and we read the world, Izanetti told me, talking about her work in her town, and things go on from there.
I'm now going to talk about Jessie Boness, whose decisions and life embody in many ways what my dad brought up in the beginning of his speaking about the tension between the streets and the institutions, decisions about where and how to fight for change. Jessie is on the left in the slide, and we'll talk about Vera, who's on the right, in a little while. Jessie is a radical and charismatic leader who I met in 2001 when she stood in front of hundreds of women who had arrived on buses for an annual statewide meeting of the women's movement. Wearing brightly colored movement t-shirts, women watched Jessie crisscross the stage, calling for legal rights and social change with the passion they had come to expect from this militant leader. Jessie had spent the past 15 years of her life organizing protests in major cities and persuading women who had never left their homes alone to attend women's movement meetings, and then persuading them to get on buses for days across Brazil to protest in the capital. And it looked like that's what she was going to keep doing. But then in 2001, she was invited to work in local government, in its left-of-center coalition in Ibiraiaras, her town, as the head of the health department. Jessie had no medical training, and she had gone to school only through 5th grade, when the 7-kilometer walk to and from school had been what she said was too pesado, too weighty for her to carry every day. And she had spent the next decades leading a women's movement. And so this opportunity to work in government caught her off guard. And yet it reflected a moment of political opening across Brazil that many activists were facing at the time. 15 years spent protesting outside City Hall hadn't prepared Jessie to be invited inside. She didn't know where her energy was most needed. She didn't know where she most wanted to be. For the first time, the government was opening its doors, not across the board, but at times to progressive activists like herself. And she wasn't sure where to fight for change now that there was more than one option. And her colleagues in the women's movement, her friends, said to her, you can't do both. You can't be an activist on the streets and govern from City Hall. To them, it was an either-or decision. And while she didn't feel that it had to be, she wanted to imagine that it could be possible to do both, to govern and be involved in the women's movement. She decided to take a chance on the institutions. She saw potential in using government resources to bring tangible improvements to people's daily lives, and in joining the institutions so as to make change from within. She decided to do that even if it meant that her colleagues and friends in the women's movement wouldn't allow her to participate there anymore. She decided to take a chance on the institutions. And at first many of her colleagues said to her, her colleagues in the government said, what are you doing here? What is someone who spent your life mobilizing outside official buildings doing inside one? You have no education, I told her. You only know how to protest and make trouble. So what are you doing here? And Jessie showed them that she knew how to organize. She transformed the health department, opened a 24-hour emergency room in town, trained a team of community health workers who went door to door, connecting residents to health care, and organized buses to bring doctors to the most rural parts of town. I have two hearts, Jessie said to us from her office in City Hall, 3 years after she accepted the job in the health department. Since the day she was offered that job in 2001, Jessie has wanted to be in two places at once, in the institutions with the health department, schools, and local elections, and in the streets with the women's movement, marching and singing with fists raised defiantly in the air. This is a dilemma nonviolent activists and movements face in democracies. In the last years of the Brazilian dictatorship and the first 10 years after the transition, it was very clear that to make social justice a reality and to gain rights, one needed to be oppositional. You needed to be outside pushing against the military regime and then pushing the first democratic governments to make rights in the 1988 Constitution real on the ground. But as was the case with the women's movement, as nonviolent movements achieve their objectives, opportunities open in the government. The dynamic between those who get involved in elections and those who stick with more traditional movements is worth paying attention to because it's a complicated and important one. What Jessie described as having two hearts, being pulled in two directions and not being sure where your energy should go, is familiar to nonviolent activists in many parts of the world.
Vera Fracasso, the woman on the right next to Jessie, was the first woman president of the farmers' union in her town, Sananduva. What she achieved represented one of the things that the women's movement was most seeking to produce, women with roles outside the movement in the public sphere. Vera speaks eloquently about the challenges of being a woman in a man's space, bringing her own way of doing things to that space. Vera left the women's movement, however, and continued her work in the unions because she couldn't play this union role and stay in the movement, whose other leaders demanded a more confrontational stance. They saw the unions as too much a part of the system, even though Vera saw the unions as very much in opposition to the system and a place to create new rights and new roles for women. In addition, many leaders of the women's movement allied with the MST, the most radical of the social movements in the area, that's the landless workers movement, and the one that most insisted on a centralized political line and hierarchical forms of authority. Vera refused to join that alliance and subsume in what she saw it as the women's movement subsuming some of its autonomy to the larger landless people's movement. So she wouldn't join that alliance and left the women's movement. We've had many conversations with Vera about why she simply left, rather than fight back through the electoral mechanisms by which the women's movement formally functions. Vera now regrets having left without a fight, left the women's movement. In retrospect, it is clear that neither she nor her allies in the struggle for a more inclusive movement knew how to engage in the rough and tumble of movement politics to further their position. Instead of fighting back when consensus broke down, they left. Vera speaks eloquently about the movement as a source, a fountain of inspiration. And she says without that, you find yourself doing things you never imagined that you'd do. Emma, should I go on to the next section, or did you want to talk about Ivone and Vanya?
Go on.
Okay. What I'd like to talk about now is what the women's movement did in its second stages. From the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, the rural women's movement successfully unified women around a shared set of big state and national level tasks and achieved them. Over the last 15 years, in contrast, women in the movement have made a variety of different choices. Choices that are involved, as this slide demonstrates, in constructing citizenship. Women have taken their activism in directions that are multifaceted and valuable and support nonviolent activism and rights for women, but that involve contrasting and at times conflicting strategies and goals. Activism in the Farmers Union was one of those directions. That was the one taken up by Vera, and Delma, in the bottom right, is another one of the first women presidents of a farmers union in her town. Through the unions, women could develop new agricultural practices on family farms. They could occupy leadership positions in the union, support progressive city governments, and work to change gender relations at home. Alongside the unions, and often in union halls, local chapters of the women's movement have carried out a wide range of meetings and self-help activities in their towns. Many years into the movement, it was still crucial for women to consider the constraints of their daily routines and how to alleviate them, to gather in small circles to relate the pains and hardships they faced, together with family members. As always, it was through mischika, as they called it, or ceremonies at these meetings and the intimate discussions that followed, that a new counter-public of women was created. One of the most innovative new efforts of the rural women's movement was the creation of a network of what they called women's pharmacies. In the pharmacies, women learned to prepare herbal remedies and to counsel women on physical and mental ailments. The pharmacies provide physical spaces for speech, problem solving, and movement building. Interestingly, the pharmacies appeal to all factions within the women's movement, from Vera and Jessie, who join unions and municipal governments, to other women who insist that the women's movement must ally with more hierarchical and male-led movements to organize in the streets. All of them find value in these new, small, often makeshift-seeming local initiatives. 5 years after beginning the pharmacy initiative, the pharmacy women in Ibirayaris were running a store called Kitanda in the center of town. Located just across the street from the church and the Esso station, Kitanda sells local organic produce, handicrafts, prepared foods, and rows upon rows of the pharmacy salves and lotions. Kitanda has become a hub of local activity. Farm women in town for doctor's appointments or errands stopped in to catch up on recent news, buy medicine or groceries, or find a ride home. As these local efforts were flourishing, the state-level directors of the women's movement united with rural women's movements in other states to form a national movement. The national movement allied in turn with an international peasant organization, Via Campesina, and emphasized the struggle for a new agricultural model based on sustainable farming practices and egalitarian local economies. In alliance with Via Campesina, the women's movement continues to carry out mobilizations and demonstrations at the state and national level in a struggle for economic resources for rural women and an alternative approach to rural development. In one notable and controversial action on International Women's Day in 2007, the women's movement occupied the laboratories of the agricultural giant Monsanto and destroyed equipment and genetically altered crops. Now, at the same time that these multiple directions developed, the women's movement did not succeed in holding all of this activism, all of this dynamism and creativity within one overarching movement. One of the reasons for the splitting apart that resulted was that the movement did not find a way to institute internally democratic practices that could provide reliable decision-making procedures over time in the midst of the rough and tumble of movement strategizing and alliance building. While the many directions that women's movement activism has taken are complementary and valuable, and could be said to represent a triumph of democracy and successes of the movement, we argue that something is lost when movements do not regenerate themselves, and when they do not manage to create spaces for speech and to mediate internal difference. We call this possibility movements in democracy, the possibility of a movement that might contain multiple visions. But what does it mean to be a movement in democracy? It means to develop all the capacities of selfhood, speech, and mobilization that the rural women's movement forged over 2 decades, and then go one step further, holding together that multiplicity in one movement, even if it doesn't seem to fit together. In our many interviews with different women over time in recent years, we saw how much they reflected on and regretted not having been able to forge that possibility of one movement that could hold multiplicity. Alternately, if different groups spin off from the original organization, then movement in democracy means keeping them in active dialogue with one another, something that again hasn't happened in our case. In active dialogue with one another, openly and without hierarchy, forging complementary strategies. Citizens, we argue, need movements to gain and expand rights and justice. And democracies need movements in order to remain vibrant and deepen. And I think we'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much for that. So just to remind everybody, we're going to go into the question and answer portion. So if you have any questions, you can get your microphone ready, or you can call in and click the raise hand button you'll see on your toolbar. It's a little hand icon. And the alternative is to type your question into the questions pane also on the right side of your screen. So just to start, I'll ask a question while everyone else gets their thoughts together. Could you speak to what are some of the differences between local and community organizing versus nationwide organizing, and how can the local and national levels be intertwined within this movement that you spoke about?
You want me to start that one off, Emma?
Sure.
I think that question has a lot to do with what we've called the first 10 years or the first stage of organizing and the second stage of organizing. And I think that what was most successful and inspiring about the MMTR, the Rural Women's Movement, was their ability in the first decade of organizing to combine the local and the national. So that at the same time that women in local communities were going door to door with nuns and enlisting women to join this movement in a fight for both gender equality and economic rights, they were also forging extremely innovative strategies for pressing government authorities to grant new rights and make change. So the same group of young women in their teens and early 20s that were carrying out local meetings to get themselves and their moms to begin to speak differently in their households, in that same moment of effervescence, they were figuring out how to develop bus caravans to the state capitol and later to the national capitol, and how to forge demonstrations in the face of government hostility. In that moment, they were aided by the effervescence that was happening throughout Brazil, and throughout southern Brazil in particular. There were movements against dams. There were against dams that were going to flood towns. There were movements to provide land for people, the movement of landless people. There was the union movement. And I think the interplay of those many different movements in that moment of effervescence of social activism and nonviolent activism, it worked because the local and the national worked hand in hand. It also worked in that period because what the goal of national activism was seemed very clear to people. It was to establish a democracy, and it was to get that democracy to establish basic rights for people, and it was to press relatively mainstream or right-wing leaders to accept these initiatives for broader rights for people on issues like economies and healthcare. I think that joining the local and the national together became much more problematic after the mid-90s, after the first battles were secured. And it's that we've explored and talked to women about, and I think our contribution in our research is trying to say, how can we think better about that moment when there seem to be disjunctures between the local and the national? And one of the reasons those disjunctures happen is because there's so much disagreement about what the next strategy should be. And they're very basic disagreements. Should the strategy be healthcare for women, or should the strategy be land for everyone, or should the strategy be a new local economy? And I think that the challenge and what was very difficult at this moment in Brazil and for this women's movement was how to, within sort of one or several nonviolent movements, how to initiate and carry out that discussion. And rather than finding a way to initiate it and carry it out and continue sort of containing those different views and forces for activism within one movement and linking the local and the national, what happened is that various local groups disengaged themselves from the national struggle or stood by but weren't active participants in it on the one hand, and then the formal women's movement engaged more and more with national struggles and lost touch with the kind of local work that it had been. So it's in that sort of tension and conflict that we see being a movement in democracy and being a movement past the early stages of activism really encounters its challenges.
Did you want to add anything to that, Emma?
I would just add that I think it was the deeply local nature of the when we talk about the Brazilian women's movement, in this case, when I say it, I'm talking about the movement that began in the south of Brazil and later linked up to form a national movement. But in just looking back to the early years of the movement in the south, the statewide movement, I think that for a lot of the women we talked to, it was the deeply local nature of the movement that got them on board, that felt really relevant to their daily lives in the sense of conversations within their families and work on the farm, and that even the rights which would be secured by protesting in the national capital or pushing the national government for certain rights felt very deeply local. And the women's movement meetings were in churches in town, which were in the most familiar communal spaces in town outside of people's homes. And so I think that it was that piece, that it was so, not only was the movement made up of people that women knew, of nuns and priests that were already familiar, of other women that had already been part of their community, but that the issues themselves, while national in their impact and import, felt incredibly local and personal.
Well, I want to add one further comment to that, which is what was so powerful in Brazil in the 1980s and 90s was that those local textures and that local commitment got connected to national efforts. One way that happened in Brazil was through the construction of a national leftist political party, the Workers' Party, which is really one of the most striking examples in Latin America of a leftist political party that grew out of and over decades remained connected to local social movements and local struggles. So I think what empowered and gave impetus to the deepening, to the success and endurance and deepening of democracy in Brazil was this connection between the local and the national. That's not happening in the same way now. One of the ways it's happening was in the women's pharmacies, which managed to pull in both the women with a local vision and the women with the national vision. Right now, there is a strong national women's movement linked to the international movement Via Campesina that is fighting for rights to food sovereignty, UN rights for peasants on the national and international scene, but there's something of a disjuncture between what's happening at the international and national and what's happening at the local level in these areas.
Okay, I have a follow-up to that, but first I'd like to ask a question on behalf of Selena, who typed her question in. And she asks, do you have a general sense about what kind of claims or demands that were made by the movement that the men you spoke about, or the policymakers, or the targeted institutions that they were making these demands from, which ones were most favorably seen or favorably addressed? And do you have any idea as to why this was the case?
Well, let me make a comment quoting Emma and then turn it over to her. But one of Emma's most astute comments when she was actually younger on in this process was that it's much easier to protest outside the governor's office and get credit for women or women's right to pensions than it is to get your husband to do the dishes.
Yes, which I said in kind of offhand one time, but I think it's actually very true, and I ran it by some of the women in the movement when we spoke with them again, and they laughed and agreed. I think that the demands for rights that women were making in the late 80s and early 90s were in some ways very familiar at the time because, as my dad has talked about, there was so much activism going on and so many efforts to secure rights for landless workers, to secure land, for small family farmers to be able to have just better rights and better options for survival on those farms. And so the demands that the women's movement was making for maternity leave and pensions, while those were new demands that they were making. They in some ways fell into a category that was familiar at the time. And I think
if I can just add a comment to that, no men in these towns believed that women would ever get pensions. So the commitment to fight nonviolently over years to get Social Security pensions for rural women was a heroic battle that many people saw as hopeless. But as Emma's saying, the actual right to pensions was assimilable with men's and governors' visions of what people might be entitled to in a new democracy.
Right, and women having a pension, while deeply symbolic, it was not as threatening perhaps to their husbands as the idea that men would help with the dishes. Because in a way, I mean, the pensions, when women had pensions, it was a modest sum of money, and to women it was hugely significant because it allowed them some degree of financial independence. But I believe for many rural families it was viewed as an additional contribution to the family's income. Whereas the idea that men would help with the dishes, the idea that women would be solely responsible for childcare, I think that was, I don't know if threatening is the right word, but yeah, it was threatening to the way that these communities had lived for so long in a way that I think I almost can't completely conceive of, having grown up in such a
if I could just add a bit, women were fighting to have a voice in the decisions of their families. They were fighting over issues of sex and sexuality, of what intimate relations between men and women would be. They were fighting about issues of domestic violence. And what was extraordinary about the work of the rural women's movement was that they were always keeping both of these things in play. They were fighting for pensions and for maternity leave and for an alternative agricultural model, and they were fighting for these very intimate day-to-day things that really would be a revolution in their local lives. And when we think about what a nonviolent struggle is, we have an image of a struggle out in the streets or occupying the state legislature that is pressing the governor to change particular laws or policies. But we don't have as much of an image for what these women were actually trying to do over decades and discovering was much harder to do than they expected. As with women in the United States, in the U.S. women's movement, and in Europe, I think women in the rural women's movement in Brazil say we never imagined that 2 decades into the struggle we would have made tiny, discernible changes, but not brought about the changes in family relations or equality for women in the way we expected. So in answer to the questioner's question, I would say on the one hand, these very important to human beings and to equality and to rights, intimate, personal, family, gender rights are very hard to change. And the other thing that has proven very hard to change is creating a new kind of economic model in the countryside. Brazil's economic success has been based on adopting globalized modes of agricultural production and entering into the global market, with a small proportion of the benefits of that going to social welfare programs. So women in the rural women's movement have been fighting from the get-go for a different model of agricultural development, alternatives to mainstream capitalism, for sustainable development, for local projects, and they have made headway in that in very local ways, but that's also been very difficult to enact over time there as elsewhere.
I also just would add to that how to, I started to talk about this, but how to change your family is not in some ways as clear as how to protest outside the governor's office.
But it is an issue of rights and equality, and that's, I think, what women's activism is trying to put on the table.
And even if you have better access to your family, at the same time, you have such deep relationships that challenging the patterns that have framed daily life in your community for centuries, the stakes are higher in a way than getting on buses and going to the Capitol. And so that's not to in any way minimize how difficult and important it is to secure legal rights, but just to say that changing gender dynamics in homes, I think, was more difficult than I ever would have imagined before I started talking to people who were trying to actually do it.
I have a question from Rosalie, but I think this is kind of related to one of the previous points that you were making, which is about this idea of the movement splitting apart. And the movement, basically, from what you said, couldn't create an internal mechanism to have consensus building, to have sort of an internal democratic system. So this is kind of two parts. First off, did your research uncover what kind of attempts did your research uncover that the movement made to create these internal consensus building mechanisms? And second off, do you think this split and lack of ability to build this consensus, did this weaken the demands of these movements or simply diversify them?
Those are great questions. Let me put the question in the context of how the left and movements for nonviolent social change have changed in Latin America over the last several decades. I think that in the 60s and 70s and on into the 80s, most of the violent and nonviolent movements for social change in Latin America used what might loosely be called a Leninist model or a hierarchical model. They were mostly male-based movements with a central group of leaders that believed that in order to make social change, there needed to be one vision and one strategy, and that the way to be effective was to enforce that vision and strategy over time. So there might be processes of discussion and consultation, but once a strategy was reached, that was the way to move forward, and people really needed to be on board. And there's a lot of reason to argue that, because these movements were facing a lot of repression, a lot of outmaneuvering, a lot of sort of internal tensions, and there was a sense that in order to make change on a vast scale, you need to be unified. And I think there's been a lot of questioning of that in Latin America, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Argentina, in other countries in recent decades. And a sense that while that might be part of the solution, enforcing that kind of hierarchy is part of the problem as well. And that the way to move forward in efforts for social change is to allow forms of internal democratic decision-making, to allow diversities of opinions, to somehow welcome voice rather than stifle voice. And in some of the stories of women in the movement that we have uncovered in our research with individual women, we discovered how much that capacity to have voice and the ability to use that voice in movement and home locations really mattered. So we encountered evidence that in order to keep a movement going and forceful over time, it really is valuable to create that kind of space for internal voice and decision-making. So we see this set of difficulties that the MMTR, the Rural Women's Movement, has faced as really emblematic of that shift from more hierarchical and centralized forms of control in nonviolent movements to a not yet formed possibility and practice of nonviolent movements that are more deliberative and allow more kinds of difference. Now, two examples of that would be the horizontalist organizing that started in Argentina around its economic crisis in 2001 and 2002 in neighborhood assemblies and in worker-owned factories, where practices of kind of horizontal deliberation and allowing multiple things to happen at the same time were begun to be put into practice. Occupy Wall Street is another example of a movement that tried to enact that kind of multiplicity rather than having one voice. And we see some of the strengths and limits of that with Occupy. In terms of the rural women's movement, there really was an internal battle between women who wanted to ally with the MST, the Landless People's Movement, and with Via Campesina, saw that as the path to more effective social change, and really believed that there needed to be one view and that dissent really shouldn't be tolerated within the women's movement. And other women who said things like, why can't we support the MST and the local unions in the same movement? What happened in the rural women's movement is the women who wanted a more internally democratic movement left. There really wasn't the on-the-ground experience with how do you fight it out within an organization with rough and tumble and with democratic means to make that movement responsive and internally democratic. And I think
just add to that a lot of the women we spoke to said that they felt that early on in the movement, especially when the movement, when they were participating in church youth groups and kind of learning about activism through their interactions with priests and nuns, and then later beginning to form a movement, that they felt that the only tools they had been given were those of trying to reach consensus, and that somehow we're not comfortable with kind of more of the rough and tumble of internal politics, of being willing to disagree, of being willing to call people out on inconsistencies or trying to kind of really argue. And a lot of the women we spoke to who had left in the late 90s or early 2000s had left the movement, wondered if it wouldn't have been better to be willing to disagree more. Felt that in the early years of the movement they had they had felt that consensus had worked for a while. And then as it became less clear, as we've explained, what the next steps would be, that the consensus didn't work and led to a splintering of the movement. And a lot of them wonder, could the movement have held more argument if they had tried?
And to understand this is one of the ways in which we look at the historical forces that gave birth to a nonviolent social movement. I don't think there was an on-the-ground experience for these women of using democratic mechanisms in a kind of harsh, fighting it out, what I'm calling rough and tumble way that through internally democratic mechanisms produces a result. I think that the models for activism on the ground were the movement of landless rural workers, the MST, which really had chosen over time to enforce a kind of discipline in order to make headway on the national level. And the church, which was very open to multiple struggles and to the empowerment of women, but really did not provide, think of the church as an institution, did not provide a model for deliberation and conflict and coming up with a majority opinion rather than some kind of less confrontational process. And to get to the so there were not as many attempts as I think there might have been or could have been, because I think women opted to leave. And that's a decision, as Emma pointed out, that they have regretted over time. And in terms of, have these splits been harmful? That's a complicated question. As I said when I described the different directions that the movement has gone in, this can be seen as a triumph for democracy and for civil society. There's the women's movement headquarters having demonstrations in the streets. Here's a network of women's pharmacies, women as heads of their farmers' unions and creating spaces for women in the unions, and local self-help organizations and meetings that are continuing to create a texture of activism. That could be seen as success for democracy and success for the women. I think what our own analysis in ongoing conversation with the women is that something was lost in terms of that collective energy, strategizing, and force that animates and deepens struggles for social justice. And that there's a risk here of each of these different efforts more or less accommodating to a kind of progressive democratic but limited status quo in Brazil, rather than finding pathways, mechanisms, and force to press for alternative economic models and greater degrees and depth of participation in politics, as well as more equal gender roles. So it seems to us there's both a success but also a fairly marked loss. And that's why we, I think, in discussion with the women we've been getting to know and doing research with, would hope to see more of a model of movements in democracy that contain difference.
And I think back to the moment in 2001 when Jessie was offered this position as head of the health department, and thought for a while that she could do both, that she could lead the health department, which she felt she would be doing with the same energy and goals that she had when she started a women's movement when she was 17, and also be part of the women's movement. And I think she, at that moment, thought that the biggest challenge would just be time, that how could she wouldn't be able to organize full-time anymore when she was working in the government. And I think that raises the question for me of what would it have looked like if the movement had been able to hold multiple different directions. But at the same time, I also see how the women who stayed with the movement and felt like Jessie couldn't be part of both, that it was an either or, that a movement, as they put it, wouldn't be a movement anymore if it had government employees involved. They had given up so much and for this movement, and had decided that this was the path they were going to go on. And I don't say that to justify their choice at all, but to kind of point to some of the reasons that taking in women who were taking many different directions with their activism and with their lives, and holding all of them in one movement at the time may not have seemed possible, even though I believe that it could be, that it should be, and that a movement that could hold people taking so many different directions could have a kind of force and a kind of direction to it that I think a lot of these women who are now doing incredible work but in very different sectors are missing.
And just to add one final comment to that, the other alternative is a kind of horizontalism. If a movement if people in a movement proceed in many different directions and are undergoing or undertaking different kinds of strategies with different goals, one can imagine a horizontal kind of communication that keeps all of that in play, forms alliances when possible, forms common strategies when possible, goes in different directions at particular times. That's also a model of organization and movementness that could enable the deepening of democratic processes and struggles for social justice.
Great, thank you. We're starting to run out of time. I think we have time for one more quick question. This is from Rosalie. And Jeff, you brought up the role of the church. So she asked, given that this religious community was involved in facilitating the movement, how have she mentions religious scandals, I'm not exactly sure which one she's referring to, affecting the family and children impacted the women's movement? Or do you think that the women's movement has now transcended this religious involvement?
The women's movement has transcended the religious involvement, but there are certain costs involved. The changes that occurred happened before the scandals in the church occurred. What changed in the relationship between the church and the women's movement was the shift away from liberation theology that's been going on now for almost 20 years. In other words, it was very clear that the priests and nuns played a central role in mobilizing young people to fight for social change. That's true in Rio Grande do Sul and among the women in the women's movement, and it's true across Brazil. If you go to any location of activism in Brazil today and talk to people in their 30s, 40s, 50s and ask them about how they became involved in a nonviolent struggle for social justice, almost always you get to the moment when the priest came, or the Pastoral da Juventude, the church youth group, or the moment in which their own personal life trajectories encountered religious activism, what was then called and would be called now liberation theology. So liberation theology was one of the fountains, one of the nurturing points for nonviolent progressive activism in Brazil, and therefore I would say for the opposition to military rule, for the transition to democracy, and for the continuity and deepening of Brazilian democracy. However, internationally, starting in the early 90s and becoming more forceful since then, the Vatican has taken a really strong stance against liberation theology. Gradually, the very influential and forceful bishops who stood for this kind of politics, Orlando, he was in one of our photographs. He was the bishop in Rio Grande do Sul who really promoted this kind of activism. He knew all the women we talked to. He's the one who got out of the bus and stood in front of the protesters when the military was coming toward them. He played a really dramatic role in promoting activism. He retired and was replaced, as were many of the radical bishops, with much more mainstream moderate priests who focus much more on religious roles in prayer and in local affairs. So the question that puts on the table is, have the movements developed their own force that will continue forward, or is there an absence in terms of what will motivate young people to fight for social change that needs to be filled, an absence that was once filled by the role of the church?
Okay, thank you. Looking at the clock, we are out of time right now. Jeff and Emma, thank you so much for your presentation, for spending the time here to present. Were there any final closing remarks or any other conclusions that you'd like to draw before we finish?
Emma?
I think that covers it. Thank you, everyone who's participated, for your questions. It's been a pleasure to answer them and exciting to get to share this research and thinking with all of you.
Yes, same for me, and we really thank people for their very thoughtful questions.
Emma and Jeff, thank you so much for the presentation. We had one or two other questions that were still on the list that we didn't have time for. So we'll be sure to email those to you and CC the people who asked those, so that hopefully they can have a response to that. And if anyone else has any questions that they think of as a follow-up after the presentation, you can email them to that address you see there, webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and we'll forward those along. And just as a reminder, we've recorded this whole presentation, and we will edit it and balance the sound and upload it to our website along with the presentation slides. So those will be a resource that's available to you. So you can forward that to anybody who could not attend. And that's, again, on nonviolent-conflict.org. And just before finishing, just very quickly, you'll see on that slide, we just launched an iPhone app a couple of weeks ago. So you can go ahead and go on there. It has a lot of resources that are very useful and relevant to this topic. And just go to iTunes Store and type in People Power, and you'll find it there. And second, we just launched an online learning platform using Moodle that includes a structured online curriculum on civil resistance, including case studies. I don't think Brazil is one of them yet, but potentially could be added in the near future. And this is a great resource with a lot of information that you can use. It's great for teaching on the subject. So it has books, articles, videos, podcasts, everything. So if you wanted to use that, you can visit that URL you see right there. And we actually have another webinar scheduled for next Wednesday. So we'll be sending out the invites to that. We'll include all of you on the list. And that's going to be about communities using nonviolent strategies to avoid civil war violence. So that's very pertinent right now with what's going on, especially in Syria and elsewhere. So that's it from me. Jeff and Emma, thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and we hope to see you next week.